This fellow, Jeff Mao, has an impressive resume. Ed gave me 29 pages, and I'm only going to read 22 of them. Jeff served as the Learning Technology Policy Director for the Maine Department of Education. In that role, he provided leadership, education, technology policy support to 4 commissioners of education. He outlasted them all. And he was directly responsible. That's an important word, directly responsible for the Maine Learning Technology Initiative. You may have heard of it, MLTI. He oversaw all aspects of the program, including vision, implementation, policy, professional development, procurement, contract management, and entertainment. No. Wow, tough crowd. Wow. No, but, woo! I've got some jokes, but I'm being filmed, aren't I? So no, I can't use those. Common Sense Media, as a result of all that work, named him Educator of the Year in 2012, and SETDA, S-E-T-D-A, named him Leader of the Year in 2013. So Common Sense Media took notice of that and hired him. He is the Senior Director of Learning Solutions Program at Common Sense Media. We're thrilled that he's here. How many people have seen or used Common Sense Media? There are humans behind this. And Jeff is one of them. We are thrilled that he's here, and I really appreciate all the work these folks have done. How about a fantastic round of applause for Jeff Matt?
Quick note, just so that this little letter right there is an L. It's easier to find these things if you're actually looking for our research reports at commonsensemedia.org/research. And I know in some of the conversations I had last night at the barbecue, there's probably some data in there, particularly in the addiction report that we just put out on teens and media use that may be of use to you. Hopefully you can use them to good ends to be able to further things as opposed to maybe others who might use them to try and tell you that you shouldn't have any technology in your schools because your kids are going to get addicted. The jury's still out as to whether or not people are truly addicted to it or whether teenagers, as we know, are just simply extremely socially connected, right? And it's just the new telephone. I still remember literally falling asleep on the phone talking to my friends into the night as a middle schooler. So I'm not sure how different it is. But again, jury's still out. So anyway, thanks for having me here. I know that for me it's nice to come out here because it is close and local. You know, I was talking to Peter last night and I said, yeah, I didn't bring a tie, I didn't bring a sports coat because we're in Vermont. I go and do this in other states and I have to sometimes even put on like my whole DC suit, you know, because it's just kind of what they expect. And I thought if I did that here, they'd probably think that the feds were here and they'd all run. So I'm not going to do that. So yeah, real quick note on the whole communist thing. So he is a cousin, but it's 22 times removed. So if I go back 22 generations, we can find a common ancestor. If we go back about 2,500 years, I get connected to an emperor. So we were saying I'm the third Mao in government. But now I'm out of government, so it's all good. So anyway, common sense, it looks like everyone raised their hand, so I'm not really going to talk about who we are, because I think you all know who we are. Just one thing to remember, we are a nonprofit, and I think that's important for folks to always remember, particularly as you're working with your parent base and your school boards and other things, to remind them that we are a nonprofit. So we're not a partisan crowd. We're trying not to tell you what to do. We're just trying to provide you information, right? So whether you're using us as a parent, looking at movie reviews, we don't work for the movie companies. We just like to tell you whether or not Bambi's mother is going to die or not, so that before you take your 6-year-old to the movie, you know whether or not you need to be prepared for that, or simply that you don't go to the movie, right? In the education space, obviously, we're looking at slightly different topics. We've got our whole student-facing curricula. How many of you guys are using this in your schools now? Okay, and so I didn't see every hand, so that means we still have work to do here in Vermont. We do have this kind of small goal to try and reach 55 million kids in the United States, so we're going to try and find our way there. If you haven't found our stuff, I'd encourage you to take a look at it. You know, as we said, there's people behind it. A lot of this stuff was developed in part in northern New England. So when I was at the State Department of Ed in Maine, we were one of their initial beta testers because we had the MLTI program, so we could kind of deploy it widely in a somewhat controlled environment in a sense, and test it out and get a lot of feedback from teachers about whether or not it was working or not. And we're in the process now of trying to figure out how do we transition what had been a PDF-based curriculum into something fully digital, and we'd love feedback on that as well, because we obviously want to make it kind of last through the ages, and PDF at this stage is kind of seen as a bit of a dinosaur. So anyway, I'll also just remind you that we have a family curriculum, Connecting Families, so it's really designed to be used with your families, including there's a great glossary up there, which I find I use too. So when someone says, what is, and they just name some app, and I go look on the glossary to find out what the app is, because that happens all the time. You get a parent come, my kid had just downloaded such and such. And you say, oh, that's great. Let me go look and see what that is, right? So we have a glossary up there for the parents also to help them understand, okay, these are what these things are, right? And then graphite. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But really what I want to talk to you about today, though, was thinking about kind of what does digital literacy mean today in this age for us, for the educators, right? Like Common Sense has been very fixated on the kids. We've written this K-12 facing curricula for kids, digital literacy and citizenship, but we often always don't talk about it for teachers. And the conference aptly named Dynamic Landscapes, right? The classroom landscape is changing and changing quickly, right? So what is it that we need to be able to do as teachers when we stand up maybe in the front of the room or maybe in the back of the room or wandering around the room, but we're in the room with the kids, but the ball game has changed, right? So what do we need to do? This is the old version, and for those of you who look at this and you don't really even remember that list, it just means that you actually are a millennial and you are too young, and it just makes me feel really old. But most of you, I hope, are close enough in age to me that you remember these as being like the goals that some person who even back then was probably much younger than you, telling you, you need to learn to do these things, and you thought like, wait, did you graduate yet? But it was your new IT guy, right? So what's the new version of all of this, right? What are the new literacies that we need to know as educators? What do we have to be able to do, right? Because you hear this all the time. Oh, we got to train the teachers, they need to do these things, right? And what I want to share with you today are some thoughts that have kind of percolated through my head as we've kind of worked over the years, both with Common Sense and also my work in the state of Maine, and before that, teaching in New Hampshire and teaching in New York. So I go all the way back to my first teaching job straight out of college in Brewster Academy, Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire, the same time that they went one-to-one laptops in 1993. Right? So my first year, I showed up there in the fall of 92, and by the fall of 93, we had handed out PowerBook 160s to every kid, and I got to live with them. Well, that was fun. So what does this really mean to be digitally literate? So first thing I want to talk about is simply classroom management. Some things change, some things don't. One of the things that I have found with teachers as they start getting into these realms is, and I remember even talking to teachers at the beginning of MLTI, and they expressed this significant amount of fear, right? It was this fear of the $1,000 distraction device, which now is the $379 distracting device, right? But having this screen between them and themselves and the kids, right? And how do we do this, right? Some of these things we've found, and this has been a simple strategy that a lot of teachers in Maine use, it doesn't flow so much if you've gone to tablet world, but this idea of close and focus, right? So teachers have routinely now gotten used to the idea that they just simply say, hey guys, close and focus, meaning close your laptop and look at me. And at other times they let them go off and do their thing. Or some teachers simply just tell them to flip it around, because it only takes one kid to hear you. They flip their laptop around, it's facing the opposite direction, and everyone kind of see, oh, which is kind of the modern version of if you can hear me, clap your hands, or raising your hand and waiting for everyone to raise your hand, those kinds of things. But classroom management really makes a big difference, right? And oftentimes we forget these things. We get so fixated on like, do you know how to use this app, this software? Can you send the attachment now? Whatever it might be. And we're not really thinking about some of these more simple things. And then also just to really remind you about classroom management is not just how you interact with the kids, it's how you arrange your room. Right? I was at another event recently with Richard Collada. Some of you may know Richard. He's the recently was the National Ed Tech Director, right, at the U.S. Department of Ed. He's moved back to Rhode Island now and taken a position with the governor's office. But he had a great opportunity to visit lots and lots of schools, talking about technology and working with folks. And he was telling me the story about one of the schools that he visited, and he said, it took me like an hour or two wandering around this school, going classroom to classroom to classroom, trying to figure out what was wrong with this school, because there was something wrong, something different. And what he finally figured out was, he said, I walked into the room and it finally dawned on me that none of the classrooms had a front. There was no front of the room anymore in the classrooms. Whereas like right now, this room has a front and it's up here. You're all looking this way, right? These classrooms he was visiting in this one particular school, there was no front. There was no obvious place where everyone was staring toward a projection screen or toward a chalkboard or a whiteboard, because kids were seated in groups and circles around tables, clustered, and there was no real obvious front of the room, which meant the teacher was constantly roaming the room, right? And it makes for a different flavor and a different space, a different learning environment. So thinking about how we arrange our rooms can severely affect how you deliver instruction. and how kids interact with each other, interact with their devices if you have technology equipment, right, and how your lessons are planned. So thinking about how you actually set up the space. And then last point on this is to be really wary of these technical solutions. I don't want to say that they're bad, but if you feel like you need to rely on some sort of software platform that locks everyone's screen or directs them to a certain place when you want them to go, I would encourage you to stop and think about, there are times when that may be appropriate, which gets back to close and focus. Hey everyone, I just need to get everyone on the same page here. Close and focus, let's talk about this, or could you guys look at that, whatever it might be. But if you feel like it's a need, because I've seen lots of folks who come to us and say, I need this software. And look, there's a Java update. Yeah, why don't you remind me later? We don't need the Java update. We don't need that. All right. See, that got a better laugh than all the jokes. That was good. We're going to have a system update in about 20 minutes. But those solutions, if you feel like you need it, then I would say, you know what you need to do, really, is stop and think more about how am I delivering instruction? Ask yourself the hard question. Do I need this system because I've honestly not fully engaged my kids? Right? And it's a hard question to ask yourself. It's a very hard thing for your principal or maybe your technology coach, if you've got one, or someone else in the building to kind of challenge you. Are you just boring? Right? No one's going to say that to you. Right? But I think introspectively, we can ask ourselves, okay, maybe I'm really just not engaging the kids. And part of the challenge may be that if you have some sort of a one-to-one program, you've got this thing that is so engaging. So we need to think about what is it that's so engaging, right, about that device? Why is it that people get sucked into them, right? Some of it has to do with feedback and feed forward, right? When people get feedback, right? What is the traditional model of feedback? You might say, give a quiz, and then they take the quiz, then you collect them, and then maybe the next day, if you're a math teacher, because you can be fast, maybe it's 3 days later if you're an English teacher because you had them writing essays, and it took you time to read them, before you give the feedback back to the kids, right? Because it takes that time to go through that. And so you have these kids moving in lockstep. They don't get feedback until they get the paper back, right? And in the meantime, what is happening, right? Because how do you learn? I think this morning we were talking about kind of 80% of gaming is failing, right? I think we were talking about that yesterday, is that right? And this idea that it's through failure that we learn. Well, it's through that feedback, right? So if you're playing the video game, like, oh, I died, or whatever, or I didn't make that jump over that hurdle, or whatever the thing wanted me to do, right? It's through that failure that you get the feedback immediately, and that's why games are so effective, because they instantly give you the feedback, and then you try again. And ideally, good games are ones where the feedback, feed forward, and the kind of risk and reward system is balanced so that people don't feel like it's impossible. Okay? But if your feedback comes in lockstep every 3 days or something when you do assignments, some kids need the feedback now. Some kids never needed the feedback. Some kids needed the feedback last week. Right? And so thinking about how can I leverage technology to try and increase the frequency of feedback from my students? Because oftentimes, like I used to be a math teacher. The classic thing I would get in the 90s when I was teaching math, kids would come into the room, okay, how was homework last night? And someone would, I got stuck on number 3. Could you go over number 3 on the board? Sure. And you're going over problem number 3. In the meantime, I know in the back of my head, he didn't do 5, 7, 11, because he got stuck at 3. And he didn't move forward because he had no feedback until he came to class that morning. Right? Now, it doesn't mean you need to be up all night answering texts from your students, but there are lots of ways, and that's one of the things we know about kids, right? That's where one of their uses of social media is, just like we used to use the phone, was calling up a friend or emailing or texting or whatever the thing is that they're using nowadays, right? And saying, did you get number 3? I can't figure it out, right? Not a bad thing. So thinking about how we provide that kind of feedback, and thinking about how we can use technology to make that happen more frequently and at appropriate times so the kids can move forward, right? Another thing that's really important, I think, for teachers is to achieve meta-cluelessness, okay? And meta-cluelessness was a term that was kind of coined by Jim Moulton. He's another one of our Northern New Englanders. I know he's spent a lot of time here in Vermont. How many of you guys know Jim? All right, so I don't even, a lot of you guys know Jim. Jim is a great guy. Works for Apple now, but worked for MLTI for many, many years. And wrote a blog post on Edutopia about meta-cluelessness and this idea of kind of knowing what it is that you don't know, right? And it applies itself in many different ways. But one of them can even be with technology, simply knowing that you don't know how to do something, but knowing that it can be done. Right? Sometimes you come to some of these conferences, you don't need to learn how to leverage that software to do this cool thing that someone else was sharing, but you do need to know that it's possible, because later when you have the time, you can go back and figure it out, or find someone to help you do it. Right? But kind of achieving meta-cluelessness and being comfortable with that. Right? Because a lot of teachers, they're not so comfortable with this notion of meta-cluelessness or not knowing something, because we're so used to being kind of the center of the world with our students and being able to answer every question. But we all remember, if you can remember, I can even remember this far back, my first teaching job and being told, it's okay to tell the kids you don't know, right? And that's become even more and more prevalent these days when kids say, how do I do this, or what is that, what is this other thing? Knowing that you can say, you know, I don't know, but I'm gonna look it up. I'm gonna post it to the classroom blog, whatever. For those of you taking pictures of these slides, all these slides are being tweeted. I probably should have mentioned that before, because my team and I were all having this little kind of internal Twitter competition, who can get the most followers, and I'm badly losing. So if all of you would follow me at jmao1to1, that'd be great, because then I can try and catch up. But I'm kind of the old guy in the group who avoided social media because I was a government guy for a long time, and so they're way ahead of me. So I have to try and show them I've entered the 21st century. But anyway, I am tweeting out all these slides, so if you want copies of them, you can just go search for it, and you can search for the at Vermont Ed, VT Ed hashtag, right? So they're all tagged so you can find them later. So anyway, back to Jim here. So achieving meta-cluelessness, being comfortable with it, maybe even talking to your your other faculty, but your administrators about this, because your administrators are probably the ones who are the least likely to achieve meta-cluelessness and being comfortable with it, right? But it is one of these things that I think is really important for us to be able to do. TPAC, I think many of us have probably seen this, right? This is probably the preaching to the converted. People know these models. Everyone's familiar with this model, okay? To some degree, and we're familiar with this model. I mean, Ruben's not even that far away, kind of. He lives down in Williamstown, right? So these two models, TPAC and SAMR, you know, this one, for those who didn't really raise their hand, just real quick, this one basically says that people know things about technology, people know things about content, they know things about pedagogy. And the classic challenge for teachers has always been mixing pedagogy and content. For the content that I want my kids to learn, what's my pedagogical approach? Technology came along for the ride, and if you think back to that first list of literacies when we were trying to send an email with an attachment, okay? Back then, we were bolting technology on, right? It was like, make me a PowerPoint with sliding bullets. I don't care why. Like, I honestly can remember, I was one of those teachers in this little school in Western New York where, for better or for worse, our business manager liked me. I think it was because he was very good friends with my uncle, who was the development director, so somehow when I showed up, I was the nephew, and so I got favored status with him, which was great because it meant he bought stuff, and then he would put it in my classroom. So I got the first LCD panel. So not projector, but it was a panel that sat on top of the old overheads, so you really had to like make the room black or you couldn't see it because the bulb coming out of your projector wasn't that good, and of course, when it got hot, then the LCD panel started turning black. And, you know, but hey, it was pretty cool. It still plugged into a computer and you could project. So what did I do? I took PowerPoint version who knows what, 1.0 or something. And I was a math teacher, so I made slides that showed, say, at the time I think we were doing like simplifying expressions. One slide at a time, simplifying an expression, which I could have just done on the board, right? But I had this great, so I did it. And of course, after the first day of doing that, which took me like 3 hours to do like 5 problems, I realized this is not working, right? It was too hard. But that was not really thinking about, is my technology use and what I understand about technology, is it being done at the service of my pedagogy and at the service of my content versus just a bolt-on, right? And when you reach that hurdle and you realize, okay, it's not gonna be a bolt-on, I'm gonna use this meaningfully, that's where SAMR comes in, right? What I had been doing was a substitution. I was just taking this new technology and doing exactly what I could have done with an older technology, and in many cases have discovered that when you substitute in your technology, you sometimes make things worse, right? When we all first got email, what happened? The little cubbies in the mail room stopped getting used, and all of a sudden everyone had 2,000 emails about food in the break room, right? I mean, it was interesting to happen, food in the break room, and all of a sudden you hear this, like the whole building starts shaking and moving as everyone moves toward the break room. And this happens it happens in common sense too. Sadly, I get the same emails and I'm in Maine and they're in San Francisco and I never get any of it. They have Thirsty Thursdays and Tasty Tuesdays back in the office in San Francisco, and they advertise these over the email, and I'm looking at it going, you guys are drinking beer now. And I don't get any. It's amazing to now not be in a school or a government office that there's actually alcohol in the office. It really is a very odd kind of thing. It's kind of a San Francisco startup thing, I think, because we're in the same building as Zynga, Farmville. So there are ping pong tables and foosball tables and all that stuff right out in the atrium, right outside our office, and I know our engineering crew goes out and plays ping pong. And there are times when all of a sudden, we get a $1 million grant and there's celebrations and someone reaches into a closet and all of a sudden there's bottles of wine that I was like, man, we got arrested if we had had that at school, One of the first things they did for us once when I showed up, and I brought Steve Garten with me. Some of you may know Steve. He used to work for me at the Maine Department of Ed, and I pulled him with me to Common Sense. And we were in the office and said, oh, let's have happy hour. Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's so fun to have you guys out here in the office. And then we couldn't do it because something happened and we didn't have time. He said, we'll just do it here. Oh, okay. And I said, where are you going to find the beer? And they kind of reached under the table like this. Right? And then they took me over to the kitchen, and then they opened up the fridge, and someone starts handing out cold beers. And they're filling this bag, and then they reached into the cabinet above, wine, some liquor. They filled up a big giant bag, so my arms are filled, and then they filled up Steve, and the two of us are walking over. Where are we going with this? Oh, go over to the Napa conference room. Where? Napa, right by Amy's office. Amy's the president. So off we go, walking over, and no one's behind. Steve and I thinking we're getting punked. Here we are walking over with like enough liquor for a frat party. And we're going next to the president's office, and then Amy steps out of her office and looks at us and says, is it happy hour? And we said, yeah. She says, great. And she reaches and grabs a beer. It's a very different culture. Not that that's what happens at Common Sense every day, but it is very strange. So in any event, back to this stuff. So I'm not going to go too deep into the model, but what I wanted to point out, and I'll talk about it more if you want, for those of you who are really interested in thinking about SAMR as a model, not just as a nice intellectual exercise, but how do I really take SAMR and operationalize this? Make it an active process that is actually informing my instruction, right, in my building. That's what I was going to stay in this room after lunch. I guess it's the 1:30 session. Is that when those start? For anyone who wants to talk about that, I've got a model and some stuff we can go through together on that. But moreover, what I wanted to say simply for these, both TPAC and SAMR, is simply having these models and having people having a common understanding of the models in your school helps to provide a vocabulary, right, which is insanely important in schools. And it's something I think we often forget. I can remember years ago at the beginning of MLTI, and we had this Apple Leadership Summit at the Black Point Inn down in Scarborough, Maine. And they brought in a guy named Alan Bain, who had been my director at Brewster. And he came in and talked about the fact that education lacks a professional vocabulary, which is one of the reasons why educators are not highly respected in our society. Right? Doctors have this fancy vocabulary with words with 17 syllables, and all of us just go like, yeah, that's clearly an educated person. Right? Lawyers use words that we all use too, but they use them in different ways. So we say, oh yeah, they're lawyers, clearly an educated, highly respected person. Right? Your car mechanic has a flux capacitor, and you don't know what that is either. Okay? But in education, we don't. Because we have words that we all use, but then if we have 300 of you in the room and I ask you to define it, we'll get 427 definitions, and that's what leads to people saying, those educators, they can't even agree on what blended learning means, right? SAMR is a way to start providing a very simple, because there's only 4 words here to worry about, but a very simple vocabulary that you can start to use in a consistent way when you're describing that amorphous term called technology integration. Right? We've all been hearing it for decades now. We need to integrate technology. Nobody knows what that means. Right? We're going to institute blended learning. Nobody knows what that means. Blended learning, hybrid learning. People used to ask me, does MLTI do blended learning? I say, I don't know. Depends how you define it, right? Because MLTI began before anyone ever used the term blended learning, hybrid learning, flipped learning, Web 2.0, social media. None of those existed when we started MLTI. The internet was a pull medium. You had to have an FTP server account to upload a web page in HTML that you typed in a text editor. Right? That's when MLTI began. It didn't begin with Facebook, and those came later, right? Far later in the game. So we kind of grew up in a very different world, and we didn't have this vocabulary initially, but as those things started to grow up, we adopted this vocabulary, and it really helped us be able to have conversations with administrators, with faculty, about the use of the technology. And the nicest thing I like about this model is that it doesn't describe teachers, because that's not what it's about, right? What are we all trying to do with technology in the classroom? We're trying to change instruction. We're trying to affect learning, right? We know that affecting learning is usually done through changes in instructional practices. So what we're trying to do is change instructional practices, finding new and better ways to do things SAMR is a way of describing the changes in the practice. SAMR isn't even really aptly applied if you try and apply it to a practice without understanding what it changed from, right? So if one of you is the creator, I apologize, but there are, for example, out there on the internet, you can find them, these like infographics, like I've seen the Pedagogy wheel or whatever, and it's got this big wheel with all these little app icons on it, and it's got all this different information. Like it's got like every model you could think of somehow in there, and one of the wheels around this thing is the SAMR model, and it kind of tells you this swath of apps are substitution apps. This swath of apps are augmentation apps. But the reality is, it doesn't work that way. It depends what you use it for. You can take something as simple as text edit, WordPad, some just simple little text editor, and you could do things that one could easily classify as ready definition. You can change the way we do things, and it's not the tool, it's what we did with the tool, right? And so it's really important to think about that as you think about these models. So that's we'll talk about this more, or I will talk about it with whomever might show up at 1:30 to really kind of dig into SAMR, but it is a great model, and at the same time I know that it's often been, I would say, either misrepresented to folks who've then kind of glommed onto a version of it. If that works for your building and it helps you have a conversation, that's great. But I always like to be able to try and share with people kind of more of the from the horse's mouth, because I've had the good fortune of spending a lot of time with Ruben, because Ruben's wife is from Maine, and so he adopted us just like we adopted him, and he came to Maine a lot and worked with us a lot at MLTI, and so we got to hear from him. If any of you have ever tried to catch up with him, you usually find he's in Sweden or Thailand or some other random place in the globe, so he's very hard to get a hold of oftentimes. Apps is another big issue in today's day and age, right? So how many of you guys are contending with these, right? And so what we mean is adult paradigm paralysis syndrome, okay? This is another big issue that as adults and as educators we've got to learn to get over, or at least understand when it's happening and what its effects are. So what I mean by this is, and I'll bet that because you're in northern New England too, so you guys probably have the exact same thing that we do in Maine. How many of you, when you were kids, if you grew up here in Vermont, you walked to school, uphill, barefoot, in the snow, both directions, right? That's adult paradigm paralysis syndrome. We don't need to do that. When I was a kid, we walked to school barefoot up, but we do it all the time. When we first started considering the adoption of iPad in the MLTI program, I remember I was presenting to the state board the options of the different solutions that the vendors had brought forward so they could kind of see them, and one of them was the iPad solution. And I was telling them that, for better or for worse, the iPad solution actually had the highest score in the RFP process. I think it earned something like 95 or something like that, points out of 100. So as a total package, as a total solution, it was quite strong as far as the review committee thought. And some of the board members looked to one of our student members on the board. We have 2 student members on the Maine State Board of Education. And she was a high school student at Cape Elizabeth High School. And Cape Elizabeth was a little ahead of the curve. They had already deployed an iPad to every student in that school. And they turned to her and they said, well, actually, back up a little. It started with, she gave me the teenage eye roll. And I kind of saw her do it, and I said, what? And she goes, the iPad is the obvious choice, right? And that's when the rest of the board turned to her and said, wait a minute. You told us at the beginning of the school year in September, you hated the iPad, that you wished you had your laptop back that you had when you were an 8th grader, in the middle school. And she actually then described her own adult paradigm. She said, I was wrong. I was totally wrong. She said, I thought I wasn't going to be able to type on this thing. We bought keyboard sets for the ELA classrooms, blah, 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 blah. She goes, today we sit in a circle in class. I can touch type without looking, and we discuss literature. She goes, it doesn't matter. It makes no difference, right? But initially her thought was, how am I going to type on this thing? Right? So they bought classroom sets of keyboards. I talked to the principal at that high school, and he told me, if you guys do the iPad thing, don't buy the keyboards. He said, I bought a classroom set for every single ELA teacher, and they're all still in the shrink wrap. He says, not a single teacher has unpacked them because the kids don't want them. They don't need them, right? So again, it's our adult paradigm paralysis. Sometimes we stop ourselves from doing things because we think we know best, because that's what adults do. We know better, right? So be careful of that, whether it's making decisions about what you might be doing, whether it's setting policies, right? Most of the policies that were set at the beginning days of MLTI were all fear-based. I actually took that slide out. I think that's why I had it in there. I couldn't remember why I had it in there. It had a little picture of Yoda, fear, path to dark. You guys know that quote, right? But it's true. We set policies around fear, and that's never a good thing. What if the kid drops it? What if they do? Guess what? Because I had the data to show for it when I was in Maine. Who breaks machines more often than others? You guys. The teachers, on a percentage basis, broke more devices catastrophically than did kids. Right? And so what I often used to tell superintendents in Maine was, if you want to do something for your faculty to make yourself look good and save yourself a lot of money, is go buy those really fancy vacuum layered metal coffee mugs with the screw tops. Like, put your school logo on it and hand them out at the beginning of the year. I said, because your teachers are spilling coffee on the machine all the time, and guess what always wins? Coffee always wins, right? It always blows the machine out. It's a catastrophic loss because a motherboard is the machine, basically, right? And I said, so for like the cost, $5, $6 per, to buy these nice, really pretty logo thing, and you get to look good. Hey, teachers, this is for your coffee. Oh, cool, great, I love these things. Travel mug, keeps it warm, Hey, you save laptops, or whatever it might be. Interesting ways of looking at things. So be careful with your adult paradigm paralysis anytime you run into these things, because you'll hear it. For any of you who are in schools who are starting to move into that, okay, we're going to do some sort of high-access computing program, right? We're going to get every kid a device, something like that. You're going to hear it from your peers. You're going to hear it from your administrators. You're going to hear it from your parent base, right? And you're going to hear it, and what you're going to hear in the back of your head is, I walked to school uphill barefoot in the snow both directions when I was a kid. And that's what they're doing. And so you have to sometimes call them on it and say, now wait a minute, is that really the case, right? So keep that in mind as you're doing these things. Remember that oftentimes kids with their technologies will find ways to get things done that you never thought of. And so the more you can kind of align your brain around outcomes, because that's really what's important. You have learning outcomes you want them to achieve. You have artifacts that you want them to produce to show that they achieved the learning. How they produce the artifact is not your problem, right? If you try and direct them to do it that way, it's like telling someone how to take notes. I want you to take notes on 3x5 cards. I had teachers telling me that when I was a kid. I never understood why. There wasn't that much space on the 3x5. I wanted bigger, right? It took me until college to understand what they actually meant by it. It was supposed to be like one idea per, and then you can move them around to write your paper and figure out what idea. No one told me that. So it used to drive me nuts. They're telling me use 3x5 cards. I'm like, and they have to have lines. Like, why? It didn't make any sense to me, right? So telling someone how to do their business doesn't always work. So be careful of that. So copyright is another big issue. I know tomorrow there's going to be another event in central Vermont about OER. Copyright is increasingly important for us to understand, and one of these literacies that I think we need to all get. How many of you guys are librarians? We got a lot of librarians here? Awesome. Okay, library services used to live under my division in Maine, so I got to love my librarians. Great folks, right? And they really became our strongest allies in common sense, helping to move information literacy forward. Copyright, as you know, then, is a gargantuan issue. Because how many of you have had a teacher come up to you and say, well, I got this textbook or this book. I only need this % of it. Therefore, I'm going to Xerox it for 412 freshmen. It's academic use. It's fair use. I can do that, right? It's like, if that were true, then nobody would ever sell more than one copy of their book to academia. It's not true, right? That's not really what fair use says. So understanding copyright and making sure your kids understand it, because your kids also now, as are you, you're producing content all the time, right? And this is probably the easiest way to get kids to understand IP rights, is to get them to understand what they own when they create it, right? It would be interesting for most of you. I'll bet most of you are actually employed under a contract that says you don't own anything you create. Might be an interesting, I don't want to cause trouble here, but it may be an interesting conversation for you to have with your districts, particularly as the state tries to move toward OER, right? So it's okay if the districts are going to assert, you work for me, and that product you produced was a work for hire. You did it because you're a teacher in my school or a librarian in my school, and you made it for your kids for use in classroom, therefore we own it. But then make sure that you've discussed, but we want to share it openly so that the whole state can benefit, so that anyone could benefit from this, right? So interesting twist to thinking about what does open, what does free mean versus what does open mean, right? Understanding kind of the paradigms of OER, the whole 4R piece, right? Creative Commons. All these different pieces are really important, I think, for us to understand, because we are moving into this world where finally, hopefully, we're getting to the stage where the notion of information being democratized by the information superhighway thing, right? That thing we call the interwebs. It can finally start to come true, right? Like, how did someone copyright algebra? I mean, it's been around for a long time. You'd think it'd be part of public domain by now. So there are ways that we can produce these things. So for people who are worried about how are we going to pay for all this equipment, think about how much you pay for things that really are pretty common knowledge these days, like Algebra 1. Right? Do we really need to pay for that, or can I just go find a digital version or make my own? Right? Increasingly, I think teachers are going to be shifting their roles. Educators are going to start changing their roles from being consumers of someone else's content to the producers of the content itself. Right? And I hear people say, oh, the teachers don't have that skill. Maybe, maybe not, but I think it's a shift that's going to happen, and it needs to happen, right? Especially here in northern New England, where we like to say that it's local control. It gives you a little bit more local control, right? It doesn't mean we all have to write every book, right? But we should have some control over how that stuff is presented, how it's done. And then really in a digital world, it's really important because what you'll discover is there's other things beyond just simply the ownership issues. It's being able to have versions that are appropriate for the kids. You may have a kid with a lower reading level, so you need different words, right? Or they need it in a different language, or whatever it might be, right? Being able to make those modifications for the learner, right? I think all of you, I've heard in some of the conversations, you're all trying to figure out how do we do this kind of personal learning plans and moving things forward, individualized instruction, individualizing, personalizing, right? Thinking about those things, and a lot of that comes into here, right? And whether or not the materials, the basal materials you're using are appropriate. Do they give you the flexibility they need, right? Which then gets into curation, because if you're going to start writing some of this stuff, a lot of it you're going to find it. So how do you curate this stuff, and how do you know if it's any good? Okay, so this is where we try and help more on the app side. How many of you are familiar with Graphite? Okay, so unfortunately, I'll say to you, graphite.org is a great website, but we're changing its name. But for now, graphite.org will continue to work, and it'll even redirect. Once we've changed the name, it'll end up at commonsense.org/education, not to be confused with /educators. It's all confusing, but we'll work it out. It's all the web. We'll make it happen, right? We're just trying to simplify things for people by making it complicated first. But at Graphite, we rate apps, and we have a pretty rigorous rubric that we use to try and rate apps, because we know that anybody in their garage now can write an app, upload it to the store, check the box, put it in the education division, in the App Store, or the Google Play Store, or whatever store, right, and claim to be for education. And then many of them, of course, say, well, I want to be good to education, and so I'm going to give it away for free. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this advertising model that they told me I could just plug in this little API and I can make money that way, or whatever they may be doing, right? There's a lot of things we need to think about that maybe we haven't been thinking about carefully enough because we haven't had this opportunity before to find all of these tools that may or may not be done understanding the K-12 market. So those are some of the things that we're trying to do with Graphite. Some of them are simply looking at these apps and saying which of these apps are pedagogically sound. Which of them, if they contain content, have accurate content, right? I remember a rather notable ed tech, well, it's not really an ed tech family so much as a rather notable political family who happens to have a house in Maine on the coasts in Kennebunk. One of the sons used to have an ed tech company. Remember that one? Neil? Don't tweet this, he'll get me in trouble or something. But he showed us his product, and he showed us this video coming off this little thing, and it was like this animated video. It was all supposed to kind of be Schoolhouse Rock style stuff, like if kids sing the songs, they'll learn the content. And it was about energy, and I turned and looked at our science guy, and he said, they got it wrong, because I don't remember what the numbers are. Science teachers in the room, how many forms of energy are there? I don't remember, it was like 7. I was a history major, so I'll just pretend I don't need to know these things. Google it, you can Google it. Whatever it was, they had the number wrong. Right? So again, sometimes the content is just not right. We want to make sure the content's right. We're also starting to look at privacy. So starting this summer, we'll have the first reviews done, and then ongoing into the fall and into the next year, we're going to continually start integrating these in, also understanding the data privacy. Right? Do these companies understand what they're supposed to be doing with data? Because a lot of these things have assessment data, for example, in them. And is that assessment data being held in the same way medical records are? Because they should be, because that's essentially the intent of FERPA, right? So you don't want to unnecessarily accidentally say, oh, hey kids, let's all download this app, it's free. And then discover later that that company was selling the data to somebody. Right? So we're going to try and do some of that work for you to make it a little bit easier on you, because we don't want you getting in hot water, and we know that you want to do what's right for your kids. But also, as you're looking at OER on the content side, how do you evaluate if that's any good? Right? Because when all this internet stuff came out, what did everyone always say? Like, oh, Wikipedia, can't use that because it's, who knows who wrote that stuff? Right? And then someone went out and did a study and determined that Wikipedia is as inaccurate as Encyclopedia Britannica. So, because things change, right? The good thing was Wikipedia is easier to change. Once you've bought that whole Encyclopedia Britannica volumes, the, like 26 different books, A to Z, you're done. I mean, that's it. It's printed, and it's until the next volume, and I'm sure most of you in the library world don't have the budget to buy a new set every year, right? It's not gonna happen. So how do we evaluate that? I put up one example. There's many of them out there. I think if you guys you're working at the state level with Go Open and other things, there's probably other models out there. I only put this one up there only because I helped work on it, so it's just, pride of authorship, but if you don't like it, I didn't do that much. But you'll find it's being used at OER Commons. You'll actually find it at the achieve.org website. So Achieve's the DC-based nonprofit that helped build these evaluation rubrics, but it was then actually operationalized at OER Commons where they have a rating tool. So you can see others who may have already rated the rubrics against certain content to see, is this of high quality? Are there assessments in there? So on and so forth, right? Tries to look kind of a 360 view of that content. But curation is increasingly becoming something we have to do as teachers, right? Whereas before you just kind of got, like I remember when I first got to the school I taught in for 7 years in Western New York, I was a 7th and 8th grade math teacher, and they just simply said, there's your 7th grade book, there's your 8th grade book. And even as a private school that charged $15,000 a year, in 7 years while I was there, I never replaced those books because it was never my turn. So I never had to curate anything, although I used to try and find things on the internet, but at the time it was pretty early days, so it was things like I found the first million digits of pi, and I thought that was fun as a 7th grade teacher, so I printed it out. But that's about what I was finding on the internet back then. It wasn't really new basal materials, it wasn't new worksheets or assignments or anything like that, it was just funny little things like that. So being able to curate content, because I know many of us now may have a book of some sort, and we say, yeah, I love this book except for chapter 2, I don't like the way they treat that topic, I'm gonna find something else. And I'm gonna swap it in and use that instead. So thinking about how we curate, increasingly another important skill. Again, I don't necessarily always have the solutions on how you're gonna figure out how to do these things, but I think it's important for us as a group and as a state, and I think Peter's in the room and others who can try and start to think, how do we do this systemically? We're sitting here on a college campus. Are your colleges working to think about curation at the pre-service level and also then providing those for in-service training so that eventually teachers coming out into the world, into your schools, already have that as a skill, right? If you're worried like, we don't have the time to curate all this content, all this OER, it's never gonna happen. Just think, what are the primary teaching colleges? Is it UVM or some of the campuses that produce most of your teachers? What if it was a degree requirement? In order to get your teaching degree, your certificate, you have to take coursework on curation. And in the process of getting curation done and learning it, those students were curating materials in a website like OER Commons or another one for all of you to consume, right? Under the direction of the professors. So that you now have what? Free labor. Free slave labor, because they have a self-interest. I want to get my degree, right? And it'll always be there, and they'll always be reviewing content. So some interesting ways of trying to get some of these things done without spending a lot of money, or at least your own money. And I referenced this before. What's most important about this notion of digital and kids creating things, it's not, you don't have to know how to do it. Right? I've met a lot of teachers over the years who will say things like, I wanted to do such and such, or this assignment or that thing, but until I'm comfortable making a movie like Spielberg, there's no way my kids are making movies. I can't figure out that software, I can't answer questions, I don't want to be in the front of the room looking like an idiot, having my kids say, how do you do this? And me saying, I don't know. Right? I'm not going to put myself in that scenario, so I'm not going to give that assignment. Right? Even though in the back of your mind you're thinking, but this is the right assignment. This is both engaging, but it's also maybe, I don't know what the project might be, but maybe the making of a movie is the right medium for kids to be able to express their learning on this particular topic. Right? If it's the right thing to do, if it's the first time you've done it, then just make sure somewhere earlier in the year, you tell the kids, don't forget a little later in February, we're going to be doing this big movie project, so by then you better know how to make movies. They'll figure it out. What do kids do at night? They stare at their screens. That's what all those stats earlier said. They're staring at their screens. Well, you may as well direct that staring and give them something to do while they're doing it. I know lots of schools who have just simply said to the kids at the beginning of the year, we will be making movies, we will be doing this, that, the other thing. You are responsible for creating your own YouTube channel of how to do all these things. And some of the kids are better at than others, but they all very quickly figure out who those kids are who in our day used to rewind the movie reel to reels, right? And then later those same kids made the clock stop blinking 12 on the VCR. Now those kids are making like how-to YouTube videos or whatever on how to do, and really the reality is they're already there. You just go into YouTube and say, how do I blah, 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 and you'll find 25 videos, and one of them you'll like, right? So maybe the kids simply curate the list. Here's our list of the videos that help you understand how to use movie product X that we all have on our Chromebook, our iPad, or whatever the device that you may have. You don't need to know how to do this. What's most important is as the expert in the room and the teacher, you have to know how to assess it. You have to understand, why did I give them this assignment? What was I looking for them to prove to me that they understood what they were trying to learn? Because that's your job, right? Your job is not movie making, per se, although maybe some of you are media teachers. But in general, if you're, say, a history teacher, it's not about the movie. It was about the social studies stuff. What learning standards are you trying to achieve with the kids? How are you going to know that they achieved it? Do they know, right? That's all in how you craft your assignment. This is what I'm looking for from you to show me that you can demonstrate your learning, right? Moreover, what's even more nice about this, knowing how to assess things, is more and more teachers now are starting to simply say to the kids, this is the learning outcome we're looking for. This is what you need to be able to show me, and you can show it to me in any numbers of ways. You might make me a movie, and if you are, here's what I'm going to be looking for. If you want to write me a paper, here's what I want to look for, right? If you're going to make me record a podcast, this is what I'm looking for, right? This is the ultimate version of personalized learning. Let the kid leverage their strengths to show you what they really knew. I know when I was a kid, up until about senior year in high school, I had absolutely no confidence in my writing. But that was the primary way in which we were asked to express ourselves in social studies classes and English classes, some of those traditional classes. And I used to struggle through some of those. Loved math because I could just write numbers. It's easy, right? But for the other class, I really struggled until I kind of got some confidence in my writing. Would have been great as a kid, because as you can kind of tell, I don't mind talking. I could have talked my teacher's ears off, and if I had had a way back then to like narrate my understanding, right? Of course, then when I did finally learn to write better and have confidence in it, I remember taking Physics 103 at Bowdoin and not doing very well because I was a history major. And so for my final exam, I told the professor, I said, look, I know I screwed up the math a lot on some of these exams, and I have figured out that even as bad as my math skills appear, I'm mathematically eliminated from passing this class. The professor said, don't worry, it's a comprehensive exam. You're not going to major in physics, right? I said, no. He said, all right, you show me, because it's comprehensive, that you know everything well enough, I'll pass you in this class. I wrote essays on my physics exam when all he was looking for was like 7 meters per second squared or something like that. I wrote essays because sometimes I couldn't figure out the math, but I would say like, it's going to get faster and this is why. Or it's going to slow down, this is why. Or this weighs a lot and this is whatever it was. I don't remember what the exam was anymore, but I just wrote him essays, but I got through the class. I never went back and looked at it because I was afraid he made a mistake, but I did get a passing grade and I was happy. Got out of physics, didn't fail out of college, and but it's assessment. That's really what's important, and I think everyone feels probably pretty good about that. It's something that I think as teachers at core, we know, oh, I know how to assess things. If you know how to assess something, you can assign it. You can even let the kids make whatever they want. If they're going to make you an artifact in some medium you're not familiar with, it gives you a to-do list to learn about that medium, right? And it may be that you give them a laundry list and say, if it's not on this list, you just need to come and talk to me about it. So you can have a conversation, a discussion about, okay, this is a whole new medium, I've never seen that. How is it that you're going to demonstrate to me that you understood why the Civil War occurred or whatever the thing was that they're trying to show, right? But how, again, as I said before, you don't need to know how they created the movie or the podcast or the name your app thing where then the outcome just becomes simply the name of the app-ified thing, right? It's not really that important. So thinking about it, these are kind of what I think of as some of the new essentials. These are the things that we need to think about as teachers in today's world. I need to know about my classroom management and understanding how it actually impacts instruction, and that I don't have to have the front of the room anymore because the thing that they're most interested in looking at is their screen. And since they all have one, the screens can be facing in different directions, right? So I don't have to have rows and columns anymore, right? And feedback and feed forward, right? How do I provide feedback, or how do I leverage others to provide feedback, right? Peer review, all these different pieces. Right? Because we all know that one of the things that makes you a good writer, how many of you ELA teachers? Any ELA teachers here? What do you often do with your students when they're learning to write? You make them give feedback to their peers because you know that providing feedback about writing is as important as writing itself. Right? Making yourself a good critic of the writing helps you to learn the craft itself. Right? So how do we start to leverage, again, that free labor? Because it's actually instructive and it's useful. But maybe in the old world, time intensive. In a technology-based world where they're looking at screens for 9 hours a day outside of school, maybe you can find another way, right? you can read that list. I won't read the whole thing to you. So that's where we are. I'm the last thing between you and lunch. I did that to Angus King once, and he said that, but I felt kind of bad when I made him do that. But he was able to capture the crowd. So anyway, in these last couple minutes, if you have questions, happy to answer them. Again, I'm going to stay through the day, because since I'm driving from here, I wasn't going to drive tonight. And then, as it turns out, there's a class at King Arthur Flour on bagels tomorrow afternoon, so I scheduled myself into that. So I'm hanging out today. I'll be at the OER thing tomorrow, but at 1:30 I'll be back here talking about SAMR and try and help some folks kind of dig into that if you want. If you have other questions, I'm happy to answer them in a large group, or if everyone needs to get food and be first in line. Of course, see, now the first in line is already done, so you may as well just stay.